The mountain is silent, not the silence of peace, the silence of erasure. A silence so complete it presses against your ears like something solid. You stand at the base of what was once the Cantabrian highlands of northern Spain, in a region that locals stopped naming on maps because naming something implies it still exists. And for a long time this place barely did. The year is 1972. A mining company has just pulled the last of its machinery from the upper slopes. Behind them, they leave something that doesn't have a clean word in English. The Spanish call it a paisage lunar, a lunar landscape, but even that is too romantic. The moon, at least, was never anything else. This mountain was something. It was alive. And then, for the better part of a century, it was made into a wound. Strip mining had peeled back the skin of the earth here for nearly 80 years. The topsoil, that miraculous dark layer built by 1,000 years of root and rain and rot, was gone. What remained was bare grey shale, compacted by heavy machinery until it was nearly as hard as pavement. The pH of what little soil clung to the surface had dropped below 4. To put that in context, vinegar has a pH of around 2.5. This earth was approaching vinegar. Nothing was expected to grow here again. Ecologists from 2 universities visited in the early 1980s and published findings that were, in professional terms, measured and cautious. In human terms, they were a eulogy. But here is what nobody told the mountain, and here is the first thing you need to understand about life on this planet. It is not waiting for permission. Somewhere around 1974, 2 years after the machinery left, 2 winters after the last blast echo faded down the valley, a botanist named Isabel Cortez was conducting a survey of the surrounding hills when she noticed something on the edge of a photograph she'd taken almost by accident. A smear of green, not the grey-green of lichen, something else, something almost defiant in its colour. She climbed back up. What she found was a single plant of Arabidopsis thaliana, Thala cress, growing in a crack where a boulder had split. The crack had collected a few millimetres of wind-blown dust. The plant was no taller than your thumb. Its roots were barely an inch long, and yet it had flowered. Cortez later wrote in her field notebook, not in a paper, just in the private record of a scientist still processing what she was seeing, "This should not be here, and yet here it is. Which of us, I wonder, is wrong?" She was not wrong, neither was the plant. What she was witnessing, though she didn't yet have the full language for it, was the first breath of what ecologists now call primary succession, the colonization of bare, lifeless substrate by pioneering species. It is one of the oldest processes on Earth, older than forests, older than soil itself. After volcanic eruptions, after glaciers retreat, after the kind of industrial devastation that had been visited on this mountain, life comes back. Not all at once, not easily, but with a patience that makes human timescales feel like a single heartbeat. The question is not whether life returns. It always does, given enough time. The question is how. The question is what invisible architecture must be built, layer by layer, before the mountain can breathe again. And the answer, when you trace it fully, is one of the most extraordinary stories in biology. It begins, as so much does, with things too small to see. In the years immediately following the cessation of mining, microbial communities began to establish themselves in the most sheltered microhabitats. The undersides of rocks, the narrow crevices where morning moisture lingered an hour longer than anywhere else. These were not plants. They were not animals. They were communities of bacteria and archaea so ancient that their ancestors were alive before the first multicellular organism drew breath on this planet. Cyanobacteria, sometimes still called blue-green algae, though they are not algae at all, began fixing atmospheric nitrogen directly into the shale. In doing so, they were performing a kind of alchemy. They were pulling fertility out of thin air. This is perhaps the most underappreciated act in the history of the natural world. Nitrogen makes up 78% of our atmosphere. It is everywhere, and yet most life cannot use it in that form. It must be fixed, converted into ammonia, into nitrates, before a plant can absorb it, before a cell can build protein from it. The cyanobacteria on this mountain were doing exactly that, for free, for no reason except that this is what they have done for 3.5 billion years. Who teaches a bacterium to heal a mountain? The question sounds absurd until you sit with it long enough and realize it only sounds absurd because we have forgotten how ancient healing is. By 1978, The crusts of cyanobacteria had become visible to the naked eye in certain sections of the slope. Dark, almost black films across the grey rock. Hikers who passed through, rare as they were, often assumed it was a residue of the mining. It wasn't. It was the first sentence of a story that would take decades to finish. Following the bacteria came the fungi. Not the fruiting body fungi of autumn forests, those would come much later. These were the microscopic hyphae-spinning species that find their purpose in decomposition and mineral extraction. Fungal hyphae, those extraordinarily fine filaments that form the body of a fungus, can penetrate rock, not metaphorically, literally. They secrete organic acids that dissolve minerals from the shale surface, releasing phosphorus and potassium and iron in forms that future plants could eventually absorb. The fungi were not feeding the mountain for their own benefit. They were not thinking about the future forest. They were simply doing what they do. And in doing so, they were building something. Nature does not plan. And yet, looking back at this mountain across 50 years of recovery, it is almost impossible not to see intention in the sequence of it all. The lichens arrived next, those peculiar dual organisms, fungus and photosynthetic partner so thoroughly intertwined that for much of scientific history they were classified as a single species. Lichens are among the most patient things alive. A centimeter of lichen growth can represent decades of work. The species that colonized the Upper Cantabrian shales in those early years were Rhizocarpon and Aspercilia, crust-forming species that glue themselves to bare rock with a tenacity that survives both drought and frost. They are not pretty by most human definitions. They are pale grey and mustard yellow, and they look like spills. But they are laboratories. They are processing rock into something that one day might become soil. It takes, on average, between 500 and 1,000 years to build 1 inch of topsoil through natural processes. Let that sit for a moment. Let it change the way you look at the ground beneath your feet. The dark earth in a garden or a forest floor is not a backdrop. It is an archive. It is time, compressed. On this mountain, the industry had removed that archive in a single human lifetime. The question that nobody in 1972 could answer, the question that still quietly haunts restoration ecologists, was whether it could be rebuilt. Not in 1,000 years, not in a century, but within a time frame that a living landscape could survive. Cortés returned to the mountain every 3 years through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. She documented the slow accumulation of biological soil crust across the lower slopes. She noted the arrival of a tiny fern, Asplenium septentrionale, in a sheltered gully around 1981. She recorded the first grass, Deschampsia flexuosa, wavy hair grass, bending in the mountain wind like a question mark. But the turning point, the moment that would later be described in a 2009 paper by the Universidad de Oviedo as an unexpected acceleration of successional dynamics, came in the winter of 1986. A wolf pack crossed the mountain. Not to live there, not yet. They were passing through, moving between territories in the recovering wolf populations of the Cantabrian range, a recovery that was itself a kind of miracle, happening parallel to and entirely independent of what was unfolding on the stripped slopes. The wolves crossed. They rested for perhaps a day on the southern face, and they left behind something that would change the trajectory of this place more than any of the preceding 12 years of microbial patient work. They left carcasses, the remnants of prey. They left scat, rich with seed and with gut bacteria. They left disturbance, the kind of random, churning, digging disturbance that opens ground and redistributes nutrients. And they left, without knowing it, the ghost of an idea. Because where the wolves had briefly rested, the vegetation, in subsequent years, grew differently, faster, more diverse. The nitrogen from their waste, the seeds embedded in their droppings, the physical disruption of their movement, all of it worked synergistically with the biological crust that had been building beneath the surface. Within 3 years of that crossing, a researcher visiting the site noted a patch of soil on the southern slope that had measurably different properties from the surrounding substrate. Darker, slightly moister, chemically distinct. It was approximately 40 square meters. It was, by any measure, a beginning. The wolves did not return that year, or the next, but the seeds they had left behind were not waiting. By 1993, the 40 square meters had become 400. By 2001, The southern face of the mountain had a continuous, if sparse, grass and forb cover across nearly 30% of its surface. Invertebrates had arrived: beetles, springtails, mites. A kestrel nested on a rock outcrop. A pair of stone chats arrived one spring and apparently decided the mountain was adequate. The mountain, it seemed, had a different opinion of itself than the ecologists of 1982. And then, in the spring of 2004, something was spotted in a sheltered bowl near the summit. A young rowan tree, Sorbus aucuparia, mountain ash, perhaps 4 years old, its trunk no thicker than a human finger, its leaves impossibly green against the pale shale. Nobody planted it. No restoration program had been operating on this mountain. It had been largely forgotten by the agencies, a minor site among dozens of more prominent rewilding efforts in the region. This tree had arrived here the way trees arrive most places, carried in the gut of a bird, deposited in a dropping, germinated in a crack of soil that the crust-building organisms of the preceding 30 years had made just barely hospitable enough. The rowan does not know it is a pioneer. It does not know that its roots, when they die and decompose, will add organic matter to the soil profile. It does not know that its berries will bring more birds, more seeds, more life. It does not know that the shade it casts will create the cooler, moister microclimate in which a dozen other species will eventually find their footing. It knows nothing. It grows. And in growing, it does everything. There is a particular quality of light in the Cantabrian highlands in late September. It comes in at a low angle, amber and sharp, and it makes even bare rock look like it is made of something warm. I think about Isabel Cortez climbing this mountain in that light, 30 years after her first photograph, and I wonder what she felt. Not as a scientist, as a person who had watched a dead place begin, slowly and improbably, to insist on being alive. By the time a comprehensive ecological survey was conducted in 2017, the mountain that had been declared an ecological write-off 45 years earlier had a canopy cover of nearly 12% across its upper slopes. Birch, rowan and willow had established in protected hollows. The biological soil crust, that first invisible foundation, had reached coverage of over 70% of the total surface area. 14 species of breeding bird had been confirmed. The wolf pack that occasionally moved through the wider territory had, in at least one documented season, denned in the eastern gully. The soil pH on the southern slope, the slope the wolves had once crossed for a single day, it was now 5.8, just shy of neutral, just shy of a forest's floor. We speak often about healing the natural world, and the language we use almost always positions us, humans, at the center of the story. We will restore, we will rewild, we will intervene, and sometimes we must. Sometimes the degradation is so severe, the isolation so complete, that a species or a system cannot recover without our hand directly in it. This is true. This is important. But this mountain was not that story. This mountain was restored by bacteria that were already ancient when the first fish climbed onto land, by fungi that dissolve rock, by lichens that measure their progress in decades, by wolves that were simply passing through, by a bird that ate a berry and flew over a ridge and was never recorded by any dataset, by a tree that knew nothing except how to grow. There is a word in ecology, resilience, and it is used so often now that it has become almost bureaucratic. But underneath the abstraction, the word still means what it always meant: the capacity to return, the insistence on returning, the refusal, encoded not in any single organism's intention but in life's collective memory, to remain absent from a place that once held it. The mountain did not recover because we believed in it. It recovered because it did not need our belief. And perhaps that is the thing worth carrying down from the high slopes, into the noise and urgency of a world that has forgotten how deep its own roots go. The earth has been broken before, long before we arrived to break it, and long before any human scientist stood at the base of a stripped hillside and wrote a eulogy in a notebook. Something smaller than a grain of dust was already beginning, in a crack of grey shale, to write the next chapter. It just needed time, and it was not afraid of the silence.